That's probably the most fun I've ever had in my whole life.
Before we dive into this AIGA event that was full of highlights and upsets, we made some updates to the Outlier database that I want to share with you. You can still search for submissions like a rear naked choke and see how that rear naked choke stacks up against other submissions. But now when you click the bar chart and go to the match footage, for those of you that don't have Flow Grappling, we have a YouTube button, and it will display the matches that are on YouTube. We now also have the ability to give you statistics on positions. So if you're interested in studying cross-ashi, you can see the different submissions happening from this position. And you can also see how that position stacks up against other positions when it comes to submission. You can also type in an athlete's name and get a breakdown of Gordon Ryan's submission data. But please keep in mind that this is just submission data at the moment, and I think that's important to note when you're searching for something like a division, or if you're studying information on the ADCC event. We can see that a decent amount of submissions happened from half guard, which was due to the surge in arm bars in this past ADCC. But when you click on initiation and you see that the majority of people in the ADCC event are winning by pulling guard or defending takedowns, take it with a bit of a grain of salt, because again, this is just submission data. And you can see that for the absolute division, there were 2 guard pulls and 3 takedown defenses, and the others have 0, which is a total of 5 matches. And I entered 17. And I'm no mathematician, but that means the majority of these matches ended by points. So it's coming along, but it's far from a finished product, which is why we're grandfathering in the first 1,000 true fans into this $12 rate. And so far, we've had 557 people sign up, and a good amount of them have joined the Discord and are helping in the design of the database. And again, I'm no mathematician, but that leaves 443 grandfather rates remaining. So if you're interested, check the link in the description and we'll see you in the Discord. But without further ado, let's get into this AIGA event, and what I believe is the biggest takeaway, which is guard retention. Unfortunately, Gordon Ryan was not a coach for the AIGA event. But if he was, I think he would have told Luke Griffith to stay a bit lower when he was in mount, the same way he did with Helena at the ADCC Open. Because as soon as Luke transitioned to a high mount, that opened the door for his opponent to use this Hail Mary escape, slipping out the back door and ultimately putting Luke on the defensive. And if it's not evident by this first clip, I like to study Gordon as much as possible. Recently, we've been talking about the idea how if Nicky's head is low, Gordon's going to take his right hand to fight Nicky's near arm. And when Gordon pushes that hand down, Nicky brings his head up. And the reason is because if Nicky's head stays low, it's going to lead to an easy knee lever or arm drag. So when Nicky's head is low, Gordon's attention goes to the near arm. And when Nicky's head comes up, Gordon tries to get a 2-on-1 grip on the far arm. And with that far arm controlled, you can try a classic sumigashi. Or if you're feeling a bit more fancy, you can try and backstep into cross-ashi. But these types of elevations are going to be very difficult if you can't get underneath your opponent. So when your opponent is low, it's probably a better idea to mess with their near arm and try and sneak out the back door. Whereas if they're more postured, you can mess with the far arm, get underneath them, and start to elevate. Another thing I've talked about recently is comparing the classic arm-in guillotine with the seated katagatame variation. And on AIGA, we saw that seated katagatame finished from mount. But the main thing I've been focused on recently is trying to find ways from De La Riva to bring my feet back to the inside. And once your feet are on the inside, you can do the classic double shin sweep. Or if the double shin sweep fails, you can transition to X guard. But the basic idea is when your feet are on the inside, you can play the leg lock positional advancement dilemma very well. But the problem is when we're playing De La Riva with our foot on the inside, we become very vulnerable to a knee cut. And if we're just focused on pummeling our feet back to the inside, this knee cut is going to cause some serious problems. So a lot of times what we're going to do is use reverse De La Riva to cover up the weakness of De La Riva and stop this knee cut. Or if we're really worried about it, we can bring our foot to the outside, which shuts down the knee cut completely. And I think from here, a lot of people like the idea of K-guard, including Mateusz Szczecinski.
Listen, man, I'm such a huge Mateusz Szczęsny fan. I've been obsessing over that straight ankle that he has for about 3 months now. I mean, you see the one he did against Jed Hugh where he basically just blew his foot up without any kind of leg positioning at all.
Now, K-guard's something that I've been studying quite a bit, and I think we're going to cover that in the next video. But even from positions like this, I still think it comes back to the same idea of finding ways to off-balance your opponent. So you can find ways to bring your feet back to inside position and go into your attacks. Now again, the main theme here is that these guards are at their best when they're used together. And in this video, I want to focus on the interplay between seated and supine guard. Now the main benefit of playing seated guard is that it's much easier for you to come forward and make connection to your opponent. Where if you're on your back playing supine guard, it can be difficult for you to make that initial connection.
Yeah, well, he's just not been able to establish meaningful grips.
And you may need to resort in some trickery to get a hold of them. And this is something that I think Jozef struggled with in his match against Izaak. You can see Jozef started the match seated, and when he's forced supine, he fights to get back to seated. And he's able to make an initial connection to Izaak and threaten him with a very strong straight ankle lock attempt. But this might have worn him out a bit.
You know, you miss an Achilles lock, man. That gasses you out.
And after the straight ankle lock attempt, he's not fighting to get back to seated. And he's not able to make a connection to Izaak, and Izaak completes the pass with ease. And you can see after Jozef is able to escape, he was trying really hard to maintain that connection because it was something that he struggled to make throughout the match. Now, this is nothing new to Jozef, and you can see him fighting back to seated after the supine guard wasn't working all that well. But the downside to seated guard is that as soon as your back comes off the mat, people are going to try these rolling kimuras. They're going to try to dive over the top on a guillotine. They're going to try a crazy backflip to get behind you. And if they can get behind you with your back still off the mat, you're going to be in some trouble. But with that said, if the top player tries to do these crazy movements with the goal of actually passing the guard, it's probably not going to work out that well. So what more savvy people tend to do is use some sort of guard passing pressure to force the seated player down to their back into a supine position. And from there, they work their passing.
And that's been the recipe for a couple of these fighters over the weekend. Pressure the open guard, force him to go supine, and then walk around, pressure the shins, and open that knee-elbow space to push yourself into the north-south position.
Now, I think a lot of times the guard retention conversation starts at the legs, and we start talking about things like using our far leg as a high leg to connect to our opponent and realign ourselves. And maybe you can even use that high leg to set up your false reap entry. Or you can use that high leg to set up your K-guard entry. And we can also use our near leg to connect to their lead hip. Now, I'm not really sure what to call this, but since we call the far leg motion a high leg, I've been calling this guard retention movement a low leg. And the low leg guard retention movement also connects nicely to cross Ashia and K-guard entries. And here we see Jozef initially using a high leg to retain his guard, and then he's able to use a low leg to realign himself and threaten a triangle. But the problem is, as soon as we start to use things like low legs, we're making ourselves vulnerable to stack passing. And the biggest advantage the standing person has over the supine person is mobility.
I want to go fast!
And by using a high leg, we're basically giving them the ability to go side to side very quickly. So in my opinion, we should try and use these low legs and high legs as conservatively as possible. But the problem is, if we're supine and they're standing, we can't really use our hands to connect to our partner very effectively. And by the time they're close enough for us to make connection to them, a lot of times it's too late. But instead of using our hands to connect and frame against our opponent, we should be using our hands to frame against ourselves and support the posture of our legs. And what that's called is a self-frame. Now, I think there are 3 kinds of self-frames that I currently know about and use in my own game. The first is what I've heard called a kickstand self-frame. Now, I don't know if there's a name for the second one, but I've been calling it a self-hook, because you're pulling your knee to your chest instead of framing. And the third one, I have no idea what it's called and don't have a name for it, but you basically just grab your shin in this manner here. Now, there are other kinds of self-frames like this one here that reminds me of an old Keenan video.
I see you often start over here with your knees to your chest and then putting your hands like that.
Yeah.
When I do it, I get smashed, man. So maybe like...
The second I see someone reaching with this hand here, I know where that hand's going. It's going to my pants. So if they start going like this, I unhook my hand and I'm immediately ready to get the grip myself.
But to be honest, I haven't really seen people doing this no-gi. And if you take this self-frame in a position like this, all you're doing is helping them stack you. So in my opinion, these are the top 3 self-frames that I see no-gi competitors using. Now, the way I kind of see these being used is if you're on your side, you're using a self-hook to hug your top knee into your chest. And if you're more symmetrical, you can use kickstands on both sides of your body. And the third type of self-frame is typically used to counter the double scoop grip guard pass. And basically what you're doing is using your arms to support the posture of your legs and fight their stack pass as you try to pummel your feet back towards the inside. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be used to support your legs, but you see this kickstand self-frame especially being used all over the place. Now, I haven't seen Owen's new instructional yet, but I think he gives us the golden rule right here.
If you're on your back, you should self-frame. That's the rules.
And the reason is by using self-frames to reinforce the posture of your legs. It makes it more difficult for your opponent to create an angle. Not impossible, just more difficult. And it means in order to do so, they have to commit more to one side. And by them forced to commit more to one side, it's going to be more difficult for them to switch sides. And ideally, we're able to connect to them without having to do an exaggerated high leg or low leg movement.
You just grab any leg, anyhow.
Because again, what we're trying to avoid as the guard player is starting the match pulling seated guard and being forced supine, and immediately going into a high leg, which opens the door for our opponent to switch sides and complete the guard pass, which can lead to a very quick finish. So if you're supine and they're standing, the rule is
self-frame a bit and then grab their legs. And once you've got their legs, there's no side-to-side movement and you're having a great time.
Here we see Cade stepping on the bottom leg of Lachlan to pin it. And because it's a supine versus standing situation and Lachlan has no connection to Cade, he takes a self-hook on his top leg. And here we see Fabricio Andre and AIGA using that same foot pin tactic. And because there's no self-hook on the top leg, he tries a quick leg drag to the other side. Now his opponent is able to high leg over to retain, but you can see he got very deep on this guard pass. And you can see Lachlan uses that self hook until he connects with Cade. And once he makes that connection, he lets go of that self hook and initiates his attacks. So again, the rule is if you're supine and they're standing, you self frame until you make connection. Now there are people that play supine guard extremely well, Lachlan being one of them and Mikey being another. And they actually have a YouTube video together explaining some insights about this, so if you're interested in that, check it out. But I think a good strategy for the majority of people is to fight to get back to a seated position. Now again, this doesn't apply to everyone, and if you're Gordon Ryan in a no time limit match, you could make a decision to play a supine-based game to conserve energy. But as a general rule, I think the interplay between seated and supine guard is where they're both at their most effective. I think kind of the classic example of this is you make your connection seated and then you go supine. which makes total sense, right? Because it's hard to make that connection from a supine position, and you use seated guard to cover up that weakness. But another great way to utilize this connection is by going from supine to seated. And in my opinion, a great example of this is from this position here. Maybe we got here from doing a low leg. Maybe we got here from doing a high leg. Or maybe we got here just because we're worried about the knee cut and we bring our foot to the outside. If they want to clear this foot, they're going to lean back. And when they lean back, they give us space to sit up. If we bring our foot to the outside and they don't want us to sit up, that means they're going to have to push off of our chest. We just say thank you because the hardest part about playing supine is connection, and they just gave us the ability to connect with their upper body. And even if we're not able to do anything meaningful with that connection, they're going to think twice about doing it again. And this time, maybe they're not going to post on your chest, in which case you would just sit up. So as we watch this sequence from Jozef Chen, I think you'll see this being done at a very high level. He starts off with a low leg to retain his guard, and it looks like he's trying to set up a K-guard type entry off this low leg. But his opponent falls down, so Jozef says, cool, I'm going to take this opportunity to pummel my foot to the inside and sit up. And quickly he transitions from a seated reverse de la Riva situation to a shin on shin. So it's the interplay between supine and seated guard that gave Jozef the opportunity to pummel his feet back to the inside and get into his attacks. Now again, I think in the next video I want to talk more about the high leg, the low leg, and K-guard because they all link really well together. But I really wanted to start the conversation of supine guard retention with self-frames. Because if you don't have self-frames, you're going to be forced into doing an exaggerated version of a high leg or low leg, which is going to get you in trouble. So hopefully you found this video helpful, and be sure to check out the link in the description below for the database, and I'll talk to you all in the Discord.